This week I'd like to talk about fluids. Fluids are on the FX menu, drop-down menu here in Maya, and fluids aren't, they're simulations of explosions, fire, smoke, things of that nature. Not necessarily water, but more kind of like smoke simulations or fire simulations. So we're just going to kind of touch upon this a little bit. And if you've noticed, I've made my background black here in my viewport so I can really see my fluid simulation. And to do that, you can go to Windows and, I'm sorry, yeah, Windows, Settings, Preferences, and then Color Settings. And then under 3D Views, you have a background and you can change the color of the background. So I'm just going to drop it all the way down to black. So the first thing we'll talk about here is creating a fluid container. There's a number of ways to create fluids, but let's first do it. We're going to just deal with 3D fluids. So we're going to say a 3D container, and I'm opening up the options here. And you have the options to add an emitter or not, and we can go ahead and add an emitter this time. And then we have some options for what our resolution is. These are all things that we can adjust after the fact. So I'm just going to go ahead and hit apply and close this out. And now what I have is in my scene, in my attribute editor, I have a fluid container. That's this outer shell, and then the inner shell, turn off the grid here, is our fluid emitter. So if I just go ahead and press play through my simulation, I can see that kind of smoke is building up within my fluid container. And here we're dealing with things called voxels, which are kind of volumetric pixels. And we have, if you see in our attribute editor in our fluid shape node, I have a base resolution. And my base resolution is 10, so it means that my simulation will process pretty fast, but my resolution of these voxels is pretty poor. And you can see here that it's like a 10 by 10 grid. So I only really have, 1,000 voxels in this container, which really isn't a lot at all. Again, we want to always make sure when we're doing a simulation that we go back to the start frame and that we make sure that we're playing at every frame. If I go ahead and bump up my base resolution to 100, now you can see down here it's indicated on our fluid container what that base resolution is. And if I play, now you can see that it's processing a lot slower, but there's a lot more resolution to our simulation. Okay, so it's kind of good to keep our base simulation at a low value. Something like 40 works pretty well. So keep our base resolution at a low value until we're ready to render. So what we have is, by default, things like temperature and fuel are ways that we simulate fire and explosions, and those are off by default. So really what we're going to just start with this week are density and velocity, so just kind of creating smoke effects. And this is all in the fluid shape, and if we open up this we open up our fluid container in our outliner, and we can see our fluid emitter. So we have fluid emitter attributes that we can adjust, and then we also have fluid container attributes. So if I go to my emitter here and I can say basic emitter attributes underneath our transform attributes, I can collapse that here, but I have emitter type as volume. I can change it to omni instead, right? Now something different is kind of happening here, so it's not, this might be a better place to start. And you can also see that we have this fluid container is containing the fluid, and it's set to a particular size. I'm going to just maybe increase my timeline so I can see more of the simulation. So it's going to fill this container with this fluid. And we also have, we're not working with nucleus dynamics, but we still are having things like gravity. And if we go to our fluid container, that's where we can see some of these other attributes. So aside from our container properties, another thing, let's get into this maybe a little bit. Some of our container properties here, we always want to keep our voxel square. This is a default, leave it on. If we ever want to disable the simulation, just click this box. And then these boundaries basically tell you, do you want in either direction on each axis to have a boundary? And so you can set this to yes or no. One side, the negative side. Okay, so let's see what that looks like if I cut that out. Or probably even better would be to get rid of the y boundary. But now you can see that in the x direction here, right, that it's not collecting along this face, right? You can see that. Probably better would be for a y boundary on the positive. Let's see if we can, what will happen if I remove that. Let's say negative side. Although that should have been the positive side. There we are, negative side, okay? So we're still not going to render anything outside of this fluid container, but it's no longer going to collect, the fluid isn't going to collect along that boundary. So something we can do really easily to kind of stretch our fluid in all directions is to go to auto resize. So container properties, something like this is good. Let's collapse this down. Container method, this is fine for now. Okay, if we're going to work with temperature or fuel, we'll turn these on. But for now, we're not going to. And then if I go down to, okay, display here. So this is where I can see how, if I want to look at this box or not, I can turn this off so I don't even have to see it in my scene. Okay. And then I'm going to jump down to auto resize. Okay, just for quickly. And auto resize, if I turn this on, let me go back to my display and turn back on my boundary box. If I turn on auto resize, okay, now this boundary, the boundary of our fluid will grow with the size of the fluid as it's being emitted. Okay, so this is actually a really great way to simulate fluids. Not to be using a kind of fixed boundary box, but you can use it if you need to. So that's under auto resize. Under dynamic simulation, we have our dynamics properties. Gravity, viscosity is, the viscosity of it. So these are all things that you can play with. So we can turn on the viscosity, and now we have a different texture to our fluid. Turn that all the way up. And now it's really viscous, so it means it's kind of like really contained and dense. Things like friction and then an overall damping. So that's under dynamic simulation. And then if we go down to content details, this is where all of our details for our properties for this fluid are. Density scale, buoyancy, noise, things like this. Under velocity, we have swirl and velocity scale. So I would just kind of mess around with these and see what you like. Like, let's increase the noise, and let's make some swirl and noise on our velocity, and let's see what this looks like. Let's also turn off, before we get started, display, and let's get rid of our bounding box. We don't need it. And now we have a fluid simulation that's doing something different. We can see that noise, and we can see some of the smaller swirls within the velocity. Density scale, okay, this says like how dense or not this fluid is. So we can increase that. Buoyancy is going to be how much it will kind of float, or how quickly it will rise. Things like tension, how much it kind of wants to stay together, and then pull apart so it kind of collects in pockets when you increase the tension. You can see how that's a totally different type of simulation now. Dissipation and diffusion are how quickly it will like expand and disappear in the space. See, so it's starting to kind of disappear when I increase that dissipation. Now we have some artifact. You have some, I think the density might be too much, but we can also change, we'll go into shading in a little bit. So those are some of these initial properties to kind of play around with. And those are all going to be under, again, the content details. You can mess around with self-attraction or repulsion, but is off by default. But I think that there's enough to play with just here in the density to velocity. Oh, we can go to turbulence too. Let's like put some turbulence on this. Okay. So you can simulate clouds, anything that is kind of a gas, you'd simulate. Any kind of gaseous material you'd simulate with the fluid. Now there are presets here. Who knows what half of these presets, what they even mean. But you can play with those too and see if there's something there. Now the fun part about fluids, like the fun part about almost all of this for us as artists, is working with the color. At least I think so. I'm gonna maybe make this look a little better. I think there's too much going on here with this tension. And let's turn down the noise. Turn down the tension all the way. It's too much. Let's see, maybe what do we have? Density scale is there's too much going on with the density scale. Well, I don't know what I had before that looked good, but this isn't it. Anyhow, let's see. Buoyancy, dissipation, and diffusion. Bump those down. That'll make it look better. Maybe noise was interesting. Increase the noise. And decrease some of the density. Okay, something more interesting is happening now. So I'm just going to pause it here and go down to let's collapse this content details and go to shading. And under shading, I have like how transparent this is, if it has a glow to it, and then I have color and incandescence and opacity are my different attributes I can play with. So right off the bat, I'll play with color, and you can see here that it's under constant, but I can set this to density instead. And what this basically means is that over this ramp value, right, I can click this little arrow and I can make a ramp with this, and more or less dense, however more or less dense this. So you can see a little bit of the blue coming in. Okay, so where it's really less dense, I have it at white. So let me change that. Change it to green. Okay, and then where it's more dense, it can be a kind of blue color. You can do something like this. And it's really showing me that there's not a lot of density here quite yet, right? And there's some down here. Okay, but this is how we can start to change some of the colors. Incandescence is something that's set to temperature right now, because in the next lessons we'll get into fire and things like that. And then we have opacity. So basically and you can see opacity input. So the density is what's driving, where it's less dense, there's no opacity, and when there's full density, there's 100% opacity. Okay, so let's, if we render this, we won't see anything. We need to have a light on in the scene. We need lights to be able to see the fluids. And another thing to remember is for our content properties, container properties, the higher the base resolution. I think 40 is kind of a minimum I would recommend here, but for rendering. If we want to see what this looks like, I'll just throw Arnold light in the scene really quick. Let me also say, if I go to my light here, and for my camera visibility, I don't want any camera visibility. So I don't want my light to appear in the scene, but I want it to illuminate what's in the scene. So let's do a little render here. Oh, that's my project, excuse me. And so now let's see this render. And it looks, you know, of a better quality than what we can see in the viewport, but pretty similar. So the viewport gives us a pretty good indication of what our fluid will look like when we render it out. Although there's a lot of density here, and so now I have that kind of strange, kind of bluish thing going on there. Okay, so that's it for this tutorial, and we'll get into other ways that we can emit fluids in the next tutorial.